Good day, everybody. It's great to see so many people from across the world attending this seminar afternoon here in Northern Europe on poverty and human rights. I'm Morten Keum, and I'm director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. And my co-host today is Christina Geyer, director of our communication department at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. So, hello. Good to see you all. We have a very strong panel here today to discuss how we move forward addressing poverty and inequality based on human rights and democratic principles. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has reversed decades on progress on poverty. 200 million people run the risk of falling back into poverty. 71 million people run the risk of getting into extreme poverty. 500 million people are at risk of losing their job and being without any sort of social security. These are just some of the figures, the overwhelming figures that confront us these days. Poverty and inequality are a reality at all continents. It is a global challenge that demands rethinking of old paradigms, from the very international level, the UN level, to the very local level, local communities across continents. To frame the rethinking, we're fortunate to have not only the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the so-called SDGs, that have a global perspective, a major step forward from the Millennium Development Goals. And they, of course, go hand in hand with international human rights norms and standards. Combined, they provide a very powerful global norms and guidance to addressing these profound challenges. The UN Secretary General has called for a new social contract and a global deal. He phrases it when he talks about building back on the basis of human rights and SDGs, that they can significantly contribute to improving not only recovery, but also resilience for the future. How this can be done is exactly what we're here to discuss today. And as I said, we have a very strong panel. We have 3 panelists and 2 discussions to get us into the topics. Our 3 panelists are Professor Olivier de Schutter, University of Louvain, and of course, UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, just having started his mandate. Then we have Professor Martha Davis from Northeastern University, Boston, as well as Associate Professor at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. Her and I and Amanda Lyons, we have jointly just finished the co-editing of a book on human rights and poverty that will be published early next year. And then we have Professor Yihan Shandul from Tunis Business School, co-founder of the Tunisian Observatory of Economy, where she is head of policy research and advocacy. Yihan is also working closely with the Office of the High Commissioner, bringing the economic dimension into their profound knowledge about human rights, bringing these worlds together, which I'm sure will be one of the topics today. Then as discussant, we're very fortunate to have Amir Malik Miller, who is an independent commentator and former sustainability advisor in the municipality of Stockholm. And when in this capacity has done impressive work on the Sustainable Development Goals in a local community in Stockholm. I look very much forward also to hearing Amir. And then last but not least, Sabine Laubner, Human Rights Advisor at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, based in Malawi. Sabine is in the very front line where human rights play into a challenging environment of poverty and potential conflict. And again, I look also much forward to listening to your experience from that particular place. So we will give each of our panelists 8 minutes, and our two discussants will have 5 minutes for their presentations, to be followed of a discussion between the 5 of them. After that, we'll turn over to you. You'll get the chance to ask questions, comments. So please send your questions to the send question person that you'll see here on Zoom. And those of you who are not on Zoom, you can use the chat function on YouTube or Facebook. We're also live on YouTube and Facebook. So without further ado, once again, welcome to all of you. And I will now turn to Olivier de Schutter. Olivier, great to see you here. And what do you think, or how do you think we should address the poverty situation now in the post-COVID-19? Again, can't use the old paradigms. And what is it that you see human rights can contribute? So over to you, Olivier.
Thank you, Morten, and thank you for allowing me to unmute myself, which I couldn't do on my own motion. So it's a great pleasure to be with you, and very, very pleased to share this panel with such esteemed colleagues, not only yourself, Morten, and Christina Geyer, but also Martha Davis and Jihen Shandul, and I look forward to our discussion. What I would like to do in the 8 minutes I have is to reflect on how the question of human rights and poverty is being recast as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. Now, Morten, you already reminded the viewers of the figures, rising extreme poverty, mass unemployment, that shall be the result of the economic and social crisis that follows the pandemic. Now, on its face, the reaction of the international community has been quite impressive. In fact, the ILO has concluded from its review of some 208 jurisdictions that no less than 1,500 social protection measures had been adopted across countries in the aftermath of the crisis in order to cushion the shock for the population, for a total amount of about $600 billion. I would, however, like to put those figures in proper perspective, not only because $600 billion, although it does sound like lots of money, is only a very small fraction, about 1/20th of the economists' stimulus packages that have been adopted across all world regions, but also because the social protection measures that have been adopted are, in my view, still quite insufficient, and insufficient because not sufficiently well informed by a human rights-based approach. In fact, many of these social protection measures are not providing predictable support in the long term at adequate levels. Many of these measures are short-term for the duration of the lockdowns or the crisis for 3 or 4 months. They have to be renewed through heavy parliamentary processes. And as the crisis deepens and continues, and as the public debt of countries increases, it may be that we will face greater reluctance from governments and parliaments to renew these short-term measures in the future. Moreover, in many cases, the social protection provided is insufficient, the levels barely being sufficient to keep people out of extreme destitution. Moreover, many of these social protection measures have left people behind that did not fit within those measures as they were designed. For example, informal workers. We have in the world some 1.6 billion workers in the informal sector, plus 400 million workers in precarious forms of employment with weak or no access to social protection. And in many cases, the measures adopted during the crisis have not been including that very important category of workers, representing about 61% of the global workforce. Migrants, undocumented migrants in particular, have often been forgotten, although some states such as Italy and Portugal have been regularizing undocumented migrants to allow them to benefit from some form of support. And as a result, this category also may often be left out. Perhaps even more striking, the poorest amongst the poor may be left out from these social protection measures that have been adopted as a result of the crisis since March of this year. People in poverty may not be able to overcome the administrative hurdles that they need to overcome in complex social protection systems. They may not be able to provide the adequate documentation allowing them to benefit from certain measures to support them. They may not be able to have access to the internet in order to fill in online the forms that would allow them to enjoy certain benefits. We know, for example, from UNICEF that in 71 countries, more than half of the population does not have internet access. In countries such as Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, only 3% of the poorest quintile of the population has access to the internet. And finally, many of these measures that may not reach migrants, may not reach the ultra poor, may not reach people working in the informal sector. In many countries, these measures have not been involving social partners and NGOs in a participatory fashion. The International Trade Unions Confederation, for example, surveyed some 95 countries, and only in 49 of these countries had unions been consulted as to which kind of social protection measures should be adopted. So I deeply believe that a human rights approach to social protection could have improved this and could have made it much more efficient, the system of social protection put in place. And the reason for this is that in adopting a human rights-based approach makes a difference at 4 levels. First, it changes, of course, the relationship between the service providers, the administration, the social workers on the one hand, and people in poverty in need of support on the other hand. Instead of that relationship between being based on charity and need, it becomes a relationship based on duties of service providers towards rights holders, the beneficiaries of social support. And this is important because it removes the stigma, the shame of claiming benefits, which is one major reason for the non-take-up of social rights. It reduces the risk of discrimination and of corruption. It leads the social services to imagine how people could be in a better capacity to claim their rights. So it forces to think about issues of empowerment and capacity building. Secondly, if we frame social protection in human rights terms, it becomes clear that the usual argument for not extending social protection, which is the fiscal sustainability argument, it becomes moot. In fact, in many cases, and still in international human rights instruments, there is this idea that social protection is the end of a development process, that you must grow the economy first, and that at a later stage, when sufficient wealth has been created, social protection may be provided to the population in conformity with the duty to progressively realize social rights in accordance with the maximum available resources. Well, I strongly believe that social rights, social protection should be at the heart of the development process, even in low-income countries. Otherwise, in the name of growth, we shall adopt measures that will increase inequalities, that may exclude people further, and guaranteeing social protection is a way to ensure that any incremental growth will benefit the poorest first. Of course, low-income countries need to be supported by greater international solidarity measures, but it certainly should not be simply seen as a luxury item at the end of a development process. Thirdly, once we frame social protection in human rights terms, it becomes very clear that we must prefer universal schemes rather than targeted schemes that adopt a very narrow framing of whom deserves to be supported. The risk of targeting is, of course, under-inclusion, particularly for people in poverty who cannot provide the adequate documentation or overcome these bureaucratic hurdles that I've described. And universal schemes present one major advantage. They can convince the middle class to support strong social protection measures, because also the middle class can benefit, for example, from universal access to healthcare, to education, or to unemployment benefits. Fourth and finally, adopting a human rights-based approach means that you pay attention to participation. And that is important, not simply for symbolic reasons, not simply because this empowers NGOs and unions, but also, and most importantly, because it forces service providers, administrations to take into account the need to provide services of adequate quality. Remember the famous phrase of Richard Titmuss in 1968, services for the poor are often poor services. Why? Because when people in poverty are disempowered, are not involved in decision-making, the quality of the services that are provided may be very low without these people being able to protest. And so participation is essential so that we are not simply basing our response on quantitative measures of success, but also take into account the qualitative dimension. Now, of course, moving from the current cash transfer systems, often stop gaps in the system, to standing rights-based social protection schemes as imposed under human rights law and under recommendation 202 of the International Labour Conference on Social Protection Floors, needs to be politically a priority. And here we face two challenges. First, very often anti-poverty policies are described as welfare policies benefiting people in poverty alone, not society as a whole, and therefore those policies do not have wide support across the middle class. And secondly, there is a dominant discourse about poverty, a discourse that sees people in poverty as responsible for their own condition because they have poor qualifications, because they have failed to seize opportunities, because they have made the wrong choices in life. And so, and I close with this, I think we very much need a new discourse about poverty in order to ensure that we have enough political support for adopting rights-based social protection schemes. And this is a new discourse about equality. Equality is in the interest of all society, not only of people in poverty, as illustrated, for example, by the very important work of Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, showing how a society that is more equal is a society that is better equipped to address basic societal challenges. We need also a new discourse about poverty. Poverty should be seen not as a failure of the individual, but as a failure of society. It is the price we pay ultimately for being unable to build truly inclusive societies. Thirdly, and finally, we need a new discourse about social protection. Social protection is not a disincentive to work. It is an obstacle to people taking risks and to building human capital. Social protection, in fact, is an insurance mechanism allowing all individuals to better plan their lives, to invest in the future, and to better overcome shocks. And so I think, based on this new discourse, we need to move to not only stronger social protection schemes that are based on human rights, but also to measures that can transform how societies include individuals, more inclusive societies, not simply to make up for exclusion post hoc after the market has excluded individuals, but also adopt pre-market social protection policies, pre-market measures to ensure that societies are more inclusive. And I look forward to our discussion, which I very much welcome on this very topical issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivier, for your interesting and thought-provoking speech. And we will get the chance to address some of these issues that you brought up soon. I encourage you all to send questions. We have a send question person here. You can see that the name on the person in the gallery is send questions here. So feel free to send your questions. Now I have a question for you, Martha, or two more like. And those, so I hope you can keep track of them both. Now, one can say that the US lags far behind other Western countries in terms of social welfare supports. How would you say that this has affected the impacts of COVID-19? And the second question, what are the lessons learned so far when it comes to the government's responses to these effects?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Christina, for those questions, and also for the opportunity to follow and build on what Olivier de Schutter set out in terms of a framework. As you indicated in your question, I'm going to focus more on the US as sort of a case study that illustrates some of the issues that Professor de Schutter identified. Let me share my screen here. It'll take a second. So my remarks, as I said, today are going to focus on the US, but in the end, I want to think about whether there's some more general lessons that we can extract from US experiences in the past year during COVID that should inform international thinking about the possibility of a new social contract. And topic is inequality. Inequality is certainly not new in the US. We're one of the most, we're not the most, but we're one of the most unequal countries in the world. The pandemic has contributed to growth in both inequality and in relative poverty here. Let me move through here so you can see from this graph that food insufficiency has grown dramatically over the past year, but not grown equally across the population. And so it's Black and Latino households that were already disproportionately poor, or disproportionately facing hunger, that have seen their food insufficiency rise much more significantly than the white population or than the Asian population. Food insufficiency means that a household did not have enough to eat at some point during the past 7 days. And the photo here, down in the corner there, really illustrates what's becoming quite the norm in the US. This is a photo of a food bank in San Antonio, Texas, where over 1,000 cars lined up waiting for hours in order to receive just a package of free food from the food pantry. And there are photos like this, things like this happening all around the country, including in my own community. So this is now just the norm in terms of how food gets distributed to people that need it. Many of the folks in this line, of course, would not be deemed poor by international standards. They obviously have cars, they're lined up in their cars. They probably have mobile phones. Many of them have jobs. They are likely literate. We have a high literacy rate here, so they've got some basic skills. But in an expensive country like the US, with very few government-funded social supports and a desperately low minimum wage compared to the cost of living, these individuals are experiencing inequality and relative poverty, which reinforces the already disparate experiences and opportunities that often fall along racial lines. So here in San Antonio, I would guess that many of the people in this long line are Latino. The same divide shows up in the housing area. So nationwide, Black households are disproportionately renters instead of owners. And that's partly as a result of a deep history of race discrimination and well-documented redlining that is discrimination in lending and housing segregation that contributes to that situation today. It's not only historic, but current, that there's discrimination in housing. And so now with the pandemic and lost wages and lost jobs, 1 in 6 renters say that they are behind in their rent and potentially subject to eviction. And as with food insufficiency, it's Black Americans who are already overrepresented among renters who also face the greatest hardship and the most immediate consequences of not being able to pay their monthly rent. And there's currently a federal eviction moratorium in effect that will expire at the end of this year, just a little over 3 weeks from now. And it's expected that over 40 million Americans will be subject to eviction, have the possibility of eviction, whether they are actually evicted, how quickly landlords move, we don't know what will happen, but they'll legally be subject to eviction. The photo down here is from my home state, Massachusetts, where protesters have been calling for extending these eviction moratoriums that are both federal and local. But of course, that's very complicated, and a moratorium extension will not solve the problem, as Olivia DeSchutter was talking about, these sort of short-term responses. Landlords have expenses that they have to cover. And after months of eviction freezes, the bills have really piled up. And some landlords are corporations and can sustain those kinds of losses. But many are individuals who are themselves struggling economically, and maybe purchasing a home that they could then have renters in was kind of their way out of poverty in the first place. Without government financial support, not just moratoria, there's not really, this eviction moratoriums are not really going to solve the problem. So this is a snapshot of what's happening in the US at the moment in terms of food insufficiency and housing insecurity with respect to renters. And I want to draw from this, I said I would try to draw a couple lessons, and Christina asked me for that. So I want to draw two very simple lessons that I think are generalizable beyond the United States. And first, especially during a crisis, pandemic is one, an example of that. Social marginalization and structural racism lead to poverty. So people that maybe were on the margins before, but were not struggling, will become poor. And simply put, folks who experience these issues before a crisis are those who bear the brunt when the new crisis comes. We see that in the US with COVID-19, and previously we saw it not so long ago with the impact of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, where it was, even though it was a natural disaster, it wasn't focusing on African-American people or poor people. Those were the ones that bore the brunt of it. There are examples around the world of marginalized groups that have fared the worst during the pandemic, falling into greater poverty. Second, though, and Olivia DeSchutter referenced this as well, shifts in political will can lead to extraordinary government interventions. And I mentioned earlier the federal eviction moratorium in the United States. It's not a complete solution, but something like that, even offering temporary relief, was really completely unimaginable a year ago. Likewise, the moratoria that some US communities have placed on water shutoffs and the efforts to expand digital access to allow students to continue learning, and expanded housing options for unhoused people being placed in hotels or in other accommodations to ensure that they can get off the street. And I would say also the rapid vaccine development efforts, the money that's been put into that, we simply could not have imagined these sorts of extraordinary programs a year ago. And I mentioned here too in the slide, support for foreign aid to assist other countries in dealing with COVID, even during the Trump administration. And there's a recognition really of the interlocking nature of these challenges that we all face. So what many have been saying for a while, that tolerance of poverty in the US and elsewhere is just a matter of political will, has turned out to be absolutely true. And we can see that in the way in which there have been these extraordinary responses, not enough, and maybe not sufficiently thoughtful, but still extraordinary. So how does political will develop? And I put up here a few factors that are important in the US context, and that may be important elsewhere as well. Most of these involve using human rights to articulate collective goals. We've got, especially in the US, lawsuits to enjoin government action. There's a class action lawsuit challenging Detroit's water shutoffs. We've got pressure from the UN and peer nations through a human rights frame that is critical to the debate here in the US. We've got massive protests like the Black Lives Matter movement and marches on Washington, which sometimes overtly use human rights frames and sometimes don't, but always are promoting some of the goals of human rights in terms of participation. We've got ways to exploit our federal system, getting local governments to move forward, for example, with the SDGs, and cities like New York and Los Angeles and Pittsburgh now have all adopted the SDGs on the local level to try to move those goals even when the US federal government is not engaging with them. We've got universities to lead where the federal government doesn't. And finally, I mentioned here Fair Fight, which is a voter registration movement in Georgia that relies on really trying to ensure that all members of the society have an opportunity to have their voices heard. So the point is that we can see that political will matters and that there are ways, not easy ways, but ways to shift the political will, and that human rights plays a role in that. So Morten asked me specifically to talk about the future. And I have to say that in the context of all that's going on with COVID, it was hard for me to project myself beyond that into a far future. So I focused on a more imminent future. And I think one important and very imminent aspect of that is how COVID-19 vaccines are distributed. And we read in the papers that this morning there's been the first vaccinations in Britain. Who in the world is going to have access to these, and who within nations will be prioritized? This is an important question, not just in the near term, but to bring an end to the pandemic, but in the longer term, as vaccinations become routine. This is going to be something we're going to be having to think about for years to come. Human rights principles should be applied to resolving these challenges, and ethicists are already hard at work on it, and the OHCHR has issued a blueprint on human rights and vaccine distribution. But one thing that complicates the process of applying these broad principles is that we all, individuals and as countries, have skin in the game, so to speak. We'd all like to be at the head of the line. We'd all like to take off our masks and go back to the way things used to be for us. So to truly apply human rights principles, we have to be willing to step back and say, well, Black and brown people have heightened vulnerability because of poverty and marginalization. Prisoners and the unhoused can't maintain social distancing. And after healthcare providers on the front lines, those folks should have the first doses while the rest of us hang back. And this is an area where human rights can really provide some illumination. Just about a month ago, Special Rapporteur de Schutter and others were part of an important statement on this subject issued by several UN Special Rapporteurs together that emphasized the importance of putting the public good first before corporate profit or nationalism in the development and distribution of vaccines. Unfortunately, there are already signs of vaccination nationalism with wealthy countries going to the front of the line. Quoted in that report, as stated by South Africa and cited in that statement, quote, world leaders from the North and South have referred to vaccines as a global public good, which should be fairly and equitably available globally, leaving no one behind. Now is the time to put it into action, close quote. So again, that too is a matter of political will. And if we see that, if we're willing to give up our privilege, there can be a movement, moving political will in that direction. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you. Stop share here.
Thank you very much, Martha, for an excellent presentation and illustrating the level of inequality, and also, as you underscore, I mean, these people are not necessarily poor in an absolute term, but the inequality is what really challenges the American and other societies these years, and that may have grown, or have grown during the COVID-19 crisis. So thanks a lot, and also stressing the political will. I mean, it takes political guts and will to move the agendas. So let's now move on to Professor Jihan Chandul. Jihan, welcome to you as well. And now you have heard this, and you come in as the economist, and I would really like to hear how you see the economy that can help to frame or contribute to what Olivier and Martha have addressed, and also in the Build Back Better agenda. So what is it that the economy should do? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Morten. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you to discuss these crucial issues. So I will just highlight some key elements related to macroeconomic policies and the impact on inequalities. So first, I just wanted to highlight that pre-COVID-19, across countries, we were all witnessing increasing concentrations of wealth and also shrinking policy space for developing countries to formulate redistributive policies and counter-cyclical fiscal policies that are necessary in times of crisis, for example. We are also witnessing accumulation of debt and the counterpart of austerity measures, limiting fiscal space and reducing the budget necessary for social spendings and investment on infrastructure and social services to redress and mitigate these inequalities. Neoliberalism has been a dominant ideology since the 1980s, and it rests on increased competition through deregulation and the opening up of domestic markets in developing countries through free trade agreements. The free trade agreements we witnessed harmful impact on national productive capacities to be able to have a value-added sector and decent jobs in the countries, especially low-income countries and middle-income countries. And they have also impact on producers, agricultural producers and small-scale farmers, since they are not able to compete with the big subsidized foreign companies. I won't enter into details into the international trade order, but I will quickly discuss the different principles that have impact on inequalities. Neoliberalism rested also on privatization of key social services and reduced quality and access to the services. Also, we witnessed removing restriction on the movement of capital across borders, which limits on the ability of governments to run fiscal deficits and then accumulate it. This accumulation of debt conducted then to international financial institutions, especially IMF, to put in place austerity measures that impact not only the budget through social spending cuts, but also a drastic reduction of subsidies, depreciation and importing inflation, but also increased poverty. So the main focus here was economic growth in the past decades. And this focus often led to inadequate attention to the distributional effects of this growth and fulfillment of human rights. And the legacy of austerity and structural adjustment policies have to be analyzed and scrutinized to not to replicate the same. To learn lessons from this decade of legacy of austerity and structural adjustment policy, and address policies to reduce inequalities. And these structural adjustment policies both compounded and intensified the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 and related measures on communities who are most left behind. So COVID-19 clearly tells us that it is time to build a human economy that benefits for everyone and not just few privileged ones. And the UN Secretary General called for the UN's socioeconomic response to COVID-19 to be based on a new social contract and a new global deal that create equal opportunities for all and respect the rights and freedom of all. So we have here a strong call for transformative change, and on which economic transformation is crucial in this part and should put people and human rights at the center, and the commitment to leave no one behind. So the integration of the human rights approach into economic analysis, policies, and planning can help to reduce inequalities and facilitate more equitable economic development through resource mobilization. Resource mobilization is here key, but through progressive means, and access to unconditional funds, especially to low-income countries and middle-income countries, to avoid the impact of conditionalities on policy space and fiscal policies, but also debt relief initiatives that are more ambitious than the current debt relief initiative, which only includes some bilateral creditors and not multilateral creditors and private creditors, and are just a short-term measure, which is not addressing the root cause of structural vulnerabilities of low-income countries and middle-income countries, and which won't enable countries to build back better. So we have to also think of restructuring the debt mechanism and how to share the burdens on debt restructuration in equal ways, and promoting equality and non-discrimination. So for human rights-based approach to macroeconomics, here we have some key principles that are related to economic resources, and economic resources should be prioritized for allocation for social services, such as health and social protection, for infrastructure and investment to diversify the economy and reduce economic vulnerabilities, but also prioritize in spending marginalized groups. And we have here a key principle, which is the maximum available resources, that is directly linked to macroeconomic policies and should be clearly used by authorities and states to mobilize efficient revenues, but through more equitable revenue generation, which include progressive tax structure, tackling tax avoidance, illicit financial flows and corruptions, and also privileging loans and grants that are not linked to conditionalities to increase fiscal space and to finance social services and reverse chronic underinvestment in health and other public services, but also to try to have a strategy for developing countries to build back better through investment on national productive capacities, to also build a strong national private sector to create decent jobs and reduce their economic vulnerabilities and dependence on exports. So this cannot be done without engaging discussion with key stakeholders such as international financial institutions, multilateral and bilateral donors and creditors, but also private sector. And private sector include credit rating agencies, but also corporation. The private sector is capable of shaping the social order merely on the basis of their economic, political, and financial power. And we cannot exclude political economy analysis here. Cooperation cannot be ignored, and the private sector cannot be ignored from this discussion this discussion on reviewing the international economic order, in defining the post-pandemic economic and social order. So we have to, it's necessary to engage actions to review the international economic order, but also to review economic principles which directly impact fiscal space, such as debt and fiscal sustainability. These are concepts that are completely not including human rights, and states should not be sanctioned by market forces or international financial institutions for choosing, for example, to center the needs and rights of people in their budget decision instead of paying back debt as a priority, for example. And principles like debt and fiscal sustainability are informing all policies in developing countries. So we have to review all these principles, integrating a human rights-based approach and defining what is at the how macroeconomic policy should be to address the short-term needs, but also the mid and long-term policies to build back better. And this should be at the center of UN actions and at the center also of state engagement. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Thanks a lot.
Sorry, I'm there.
No problem. So we would like to invite the discussants to share some of their operational experiences from various regions. Amira, I am going to find you here in the... So there you are.
Can you see me?
Amira, I can't see you for the moment, but I can hear you.
Okay.
So, Amira, you, as long as we hear you, that's, I think, key somehow.
Right, I shall try and share my screen then.
Great, we can see your screen.
Fantastic.
So, Amira, you've been, we heard Martha Davis talk about the United States, the global north, but you have been working in another country, Sweden, and you work with the SDGs implementing at a local level in Sweden, and you've been working with poverty. What is it that you have seen from your perspective?
Okay, well, thank you. I'll start by saying, by thanking you and your colleagues at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute for inviting me to speak today. So yes, I've been asked to provide a case study on growing inequality in the global north. And I'll start by saying, you're probably all thinking it, when we speak about Sweden, what is the problem, really? Sweden is one of the richest and most equal countries in the world, with a strong social protection safety net. And to some extent, this is true. As the picture here on the right shows, Sweden is one of the countries that are best placed to meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. There's no real extreme poverty on any large scale. Everyone has access to water and sanitation. No one is starving, really, and even university education is free. But apart from the need to push ahead on greening the economy and society at large, which we all obviously need to focus on, there is one more significant hurdle, and that is, of course, inequality. The text on the left there is taken from Sweden's first voluntary report on implementation on the SDGs, and it clearly acknowledges that there is some way to go in order to address inequality and also gender inequality. I'm not sure if everyone knows this, but in fact, Sweden has had the fastest increase of income inequality in the rich world, or the OECD member states, for the past 12 to 10 years. But that is really a development that started off in the early 90s. So who are these vulnerable groups then that are mentioned here? Well, I'm going to try to show you that by looking at the city of Stockholm, which is Sweden's largest and also richest municipality. Now, the two districts that you are seeing here on this chart are two of the poorest districts in Stockholm, Rinkeby and Skärholmen. But when you look at these kind of figures, even the income and unemployment statistics, or indeed the life expectancy, doesn't look that bad. But if you then add the average of the city, it looks like this. So you start here to see a more worrying correlation. The pattern is more or less the opposite almost. But still, you know, this is the world's, well, one of the world's most richest countries and cities. So surely this is to be expected. And yes, I would agree with that too. We recognize this pattern from the rest of the global north. Martha has touched on it already, especially maybe the correlation between socioeconomic poverty, poor health, and poor public health, and communities with a higher number of first, second, and third generation of immigrants. But I'm going to now show you, and I'm going to try to change screens here, so bear with me. I'm going to try to show you what happened in Stockholm over time. Now, this one might take a little bit of time here, but I'll try and be quick. Now, I hope you can see this.
Yes.
Yeah, great. So this is, I have to credit Gapminder and Hans Rosling's organization for this, and also our neighboring municipalities in the Stockholm region. Now, what you can see here, the dots here, and the ones that are the lowest on the lower to the left, are representative of the more socioeconomic vulnerable areas of Stockholm. The one in the center, Björkhagen, is where I'm sitting today, actually. So it very much represents the average of Stockholm. And the two on the top there to the right are very much the richer part of Stockholm. Now, on the vertical axis, it shows the percentage of adults with higher education, whereas the horizontal axis shows the average income. Now I'm going to show you what happened over a 15-year period here. So have a look. So what we see here is that the development in the more socioeconomically vulnerable areas have, to some extent, moved in a positive direction, but it hasn't at all kept up with the pace of the richer parts of Stockholm or the average. And I would also encourage you to look at what's happening with the cloud in the background, and let me see if I can make that a bit. So from being more concentrated, it's being slowly dragged out, and obviously the gaps are getting bigger. So, and I'm going to go back to my presentation here. Bear with me. So what really the Gapminder sequence here showed us was the growing inequality in action. Our politicians talk a lot about this, but it's never explained in this way. We saw how both the differences in income levels and higher educations grew significantly over 15 years, but it doesn't stop there. I don't have time to go into this in detail, but over the past 2 years, I've been looking into how one of these districts compared to the average level of the whole city when it comes to all of the individual sustainable development goals. We, of course, used the national decided on indicators, and what we found was that for all of the goals, but specifically the ones shown here, which are particularly important for the socioeconomic development of a community in the global north, I'd argue, the districts were falling behind significantly. In quite a few respects, the development since 2015 has been going in the right direction, and clear improvements can be seen, but still, all the data showed that the socioeconomically poor districts were not keeping up with the pace of positive development happening in the rest of the city. In fact, they're falling behind even further. And what's important to keep in mind here is that the gap matters, and that these are structural inequalities. And then on top of all of this, of course, COVID-19 happened. We saw early on that more people in the socioeconomically vulnerable areas of Stockholm were infected with the virus, but also that the unemployment rates increased most in those areas. And that's in the open, where we have the statistics to prove it, but also in the informal job market. So the number of households that needed assistance from social services and civil society to meet their basic food and housing needs rose dramatically. And the impact has been significant and continues to deepen as the further we go into this pandemic. So in summary, and maybe some of the key kind of lessons learned from this, what we are seeing is growing structural socioeconomic inequality. Poor communities are falling behind further and further, and the trend has been intensified by the pandemic. We're yet to see the long-term socioeconomic and public health impact of this. And my fear is that this will be speeding up. Short-term economic stimulus, as well as tough on crime policies, will not be enough. There's an urgent need for holistic and long-term investments, especially targeting children and young adults who are absolutely bearing the brunt of this development and are likely to suffer most from the long-term impact. Increasingly, your well-being in Sweden is affected by where you live, who your parents are, who your grandparents are, what gender you have, and if you have any disabilities or any learning difficulties. I would argue, just to close here, that there's an opportunity and an urgent need to use the SDGs and human rights-based frameworks to address the growing inequality, to complement the social protection system that we have, and that we need to focus not just on the individual level, which is where a lot of work is being done at the moment, but to look at the more structural kind of levels and structural inequality affecting whole communities. So even in a country like Sweden, there's a need to build a new social contract to address the relative poverty and growing inequality. And I think, like as Martha pointed out, political will is obviously a key ingredient, and there needs to be alignment all the way from the local level up to the national level. I think I'll stop there, but I look forward to listening to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amir. Impressive. I think that map from Stockholm sort of tells it all in the sense that if we see a gap growing like that, as you illustrated so well with the gap map, with all the social support that we see that is existence in Sweden, then we know what it looks very many other places, and that is worse. So thanks for having illustrated it so well. And now we turn last but not least definitely to Sabine Lautner in Malawi. Good to have you here, Sabine. And if you would sort of say, tell us a bit on how you work on with the human rights-based approach and what it contributes to addressing poverty in Malawi, where you are. And also if you could say a bit on the link to conflict as well.
Great, thank you so much, Morten, and thank you everyone. It's great to be part of this discussion. Greetings from Malawi. One of the points, so I want to talk about how poverty is experienced in the global south using Malawi as an example, and also poverty alleviation as conflict prevention. And I think we're seeing increasing civil unrest in countries that are very poor. So a quick snapshot, where is Malawi? I'm sure many of you actually don't know where it is. It's in southern Africa, between Zambia, Mozambique, and Tanzania. It's a small landlocked country of 19 million people. It has fertile soil and a very large lake, plus a number of smaller lakes. But 2019, it was ranked 172 on the UNDP Human Development Index out of 188 countries. And it's worse than that, because if you look at the list, Malawi is the poorest country in the world not currently in or recovering from a serious internal conflict or a serious civil war. Just how poor is poor? 75% of people in Malawi live below the poverty line, and 25% of that group is in extreme poverty. 80% are engaged in agriculture and 11% have access to electricity. And that affects everything. The ability to use telephones, the ability to listen to radios, the ability to cook, the heavy reliance on firewood. Most people in this country live day to day, so they don't have any buffer to deal with external shocks, including economic shocks. Now, COVID came at a time where there was a significant cultural change happening in Malawi. Could you go to the next slide, please? And what happened in 2019? There was an election. And people were not happy with the result of a significant portion of the country were not happy with the result of the election. No, back to the last slide, please. No, that's the second slide.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Can you go back one slide?
I will do that.
Yeah, thank you.
That's
it. That's the one.
Okay. I will not
so in 2019, the fact that, you know, this is a young democracy here, we have a government that's not particularly responsive. The infrastructure is new, very high levels of corruption. So after the May 2019 presidential elections, there were mass and violent protests across the country. Now, protests against political grievances have happened before for short periods of time. What happened here that was unique is that the protests never really stopped. So the protests peaked in October. They became very violent last year, not this year. And then there was a shift in the protest. So the political situation started to be resolved earlier this year. And from about January onwards, the protest started to focus on economic grievances and then governance grievances. This was a cultural shift in Malawi because Malawians tend to be very polite. They're relatively submissive as a culture. And what's happening is that people's frustrations are boiling over. So the fact that this year, 2020, we've had between 5 and 12 protests on average a week has never happened before in this country. When COVID came and the government reacted very fast to put in measures that had been recommended by, I guess, the global north, based on the experiences there, people got to the streets and protested very quickly. A lockdown would have killed people. So when the government announced a lockdown, we had something like 50 protests recorded in 1 week against a lockdown. Basically, what's happened is that people have had enough with poverty and mismanagement, and it's turning into civil unrest. This kind of widespread destabilization is threatening to become even worse with COVID, and I'd like to talk about that now. Could you go to the next slide, please? So the impact of COVID in Malawi as a health problem was not that significant. I think right now we have around 40 active cases in the country, and we've had a total of 185 deaths in total. It's not having a significant health concern. Christina, the next slide, please.
Sorry, I think there's a lag, that's why.
It could be here in Malawi that I'm not, my internet's not picking it up. The real impact of COVID has been an economic impact. What happened is that, you know, the little tourist industry that Malawi had collapsed. Cross-border trade stopped. A lot of businesses stopped operating, restaurants closed, and there's been a domino effect of poverty. So this time last year, right now it's December, we're in what we call the lean season, which goes for 3 months. There were 1.6 million people regarded as severely food insecure. That means at risk of starvation. This year it's 2.8 million. So we have 2.8 million that need urgent food deliveries to prevent starvation. And a lot of the UN funding is actually going into that at the moment. But so to me, in many ways, COVID-19 has been the great awakener. It's exposed and exacerbated weaknesses in human rights. And how has it done that? So in terms of equality and non-discrimination, as many speakers have said, those who were already marginalized became increasingly marginalized. So the urban poor with no access to land, persons living with disabilities, persons with albinism who are under constant security risk here, women and girls, the level of rapes, teenage pregnancies, child marriages exploded, and it went up 300, 400% in each of those categories. So areas of harmful cultural practices and discrimination radically increased. In terms of participation and empowerment, a lot of these groups that were marginalized were not consulted as part of the COVID response. And there isn't really a tradition here of consultation. What we see here is quite a paternalistic delivery of services. It's the old-fashioned model that I think many governments in poor countries and even some of the UN agencies still use. It's the pure development approach that hasn't integrated human rights. It's about service delivery. It's very disempowering. If you're a person living in extreme poverty, you have no access to healthcare, you have no money, and your children desperately need food. For example, if the schools are closed and they're not getting their 1 meal a day, you have to stand in the line, you have to wait, you have to compete with everyone else. That's not empowering. That's not a human rights-based approach. And so this service delivery approach actually was exposed during COVID-19. Now, the worst area is accountability. How does a country with rich, fertile soil and lakes become this poor? It's about corruption and mismanagement. And, you know, disasters and crises like COVID-19 means more money is coming into the country. The Ombudsman last week released a report showing that 80% of the funds that went to the coordination cluster were subject to what she called maladministration. And she's asked the agencies to provide urgent responses. So corruption is what has entrenched the poverty, and therefore accountability as an element of the human rights-based approach is actually essential to the way out. So what we're seeing here is a country that has been poor for a long time, but a few elements have come. So COVID-19 has made people even poorer, if that's even possible. A very young population, 70% is under 35. The average age is 17, so they're reaching working age and there's not much potential to get a job. And information is more available. And all of that has pushed the anger and frustration to boiling point. So we are seeing an increase in civil unrest. It's very clear that we cannot go back to the old way. Could you go to the last slide, please, Christina? So what then does it mean for the next steps, for the new social contract, for what the UN is calling Recover Better? It means a human rights-based approach. I've got a little picture here to show the importance of accountability. These were significant protests in three very large cities in Malawi that happened earlier this year when the government tried to interfere with the judiciary, which is very independent, as steps to entrench corruption. And we saw judges and lawyers taking to the streets and protesting. It's, again, to give you an example, this was never seen, protests of this kind have never been seen here before. So what we need, participation is essential. Now, participation means we do not make decisions about other people. We consult with those people before we decide the action we will take for them. That goes for persons with disabilities. It goes for women. We should not have men speaking on behalf of women. It goes for ethnic minorities, religious minorities. It goes for the urban poor, the illiterate. That also means when we are delivering services, we need feedback mechanisms to inform that delivery. Equality and non-discrimination, a lot of work needs to be done still to make sure that particular groups are equally receiving services. Now, there are groups that are very sensitive here. Religious minorities, ethnic minorities, refugees. These are very sensitive groups, and yet we need to confront that. We need to integrate that in responses. Empowerment, this is the biggest thing now with conflict prevention. Poverty has disempowered people to the extent that they're angry and they're taking matters into their own hands with violence. Empowerment and dignity is how we move forward. And I think here I really want to make the point about the link between economic, social, cultural rights and civil and political rights is absolutely 100%. They cannot be separated. They must go together. And in our planning and our work, we must make sure that we're respecting all of these rights at the same time. Then finally, my last and strongest point, there must be accountability. A lot of money disappears here. People are opportunistic. And, you know, when you see the level of poverty, I mean, I can't even criticize it anymore. The poverty here is extraordinary. It's extreme. How do we work together to convince people that helping the community is actually helping you as an individual? That you don't have to give up your ethical principles and steal or engage in graft or all of those other things to survive and for your family to survive because there's no other way or because you don't trust the government. So they're my key messages, and I hope that gives a bit of food for thought in the discussions today. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Sabina, and sorry for mismanaging your PowerPoints.
No problem, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for bringing up also the disempowerment. And let's not forget that this social unrest that you point to is not only, so to say, in the extreme poor countries as where you are now, but also we saw it in Chile. We have seen it throughout American cities and European cities. There is, so to say, that feeling of disempowerment is definitely growing, and also pointing to the mismanagement and corruption as key elements. So this exhausts our excellent panel. Thanks a lot to all the panelists for brilliant interventions. And I was also, we're a little bit behind time, but that's fine. But if you if you have any questions or comments to each other before we open up, we have a number of questions from the audience. But if there are one or two issues that you would like to ask your colleagues or comment on. I think the only one I cannot see at the moment is, well, I can do like this, then I think I can see you all. Yeah. Anyone of the panelists? No, I don't see any urge to. But then I think I will start with the list of the questions, the number of questions that we got in, and I think the first one sort of covers its sort of a number of the other questions that have also been raised, and I'm sure that some will come back to it. But this is from Radumares, who asked in 2009, and it is to Olivier. In 2019, the IMF adopted a strategy for social spending, as you raised in your presentation, Olivier, which it means that the IMF can better take into account social protection in its lending. Does this signify a genuine and fundamental shift in IMF policies towards more human rights-based approaches? What do you think will be the practical impact of this new IMF strategy? So basically, what you raised on the social protection, that should be considered in the IMF lending. Olivier? And of course, if others would like to comment, other panelists, you're free, and I see already Jan. Olivier?
Yes, thank you. So I think it's a very important, but at the same time, delicate, complex question to discuss the role of the IMF in social protection. Under the leadership of Christine Lagarde, before Christine Lagarde joined the European Central Bank, there were significant shifts in the discourse of the IMF concerning the role of social protection. Basically, what the IMF at the time recognized was that social protection could be indeed critical for the sustainability of growth. And there were also at the same time researchers from the IMF that in various working papers demonstrated that in fact, contrary to what is sometimes called the Kuznets curve, the growth could be stimulated by greater equality based on social redistributive policies rather than being discouraged by the search for equality. In other terms, those researchers highlighted the fact that investing in social protection schemes was one way to stimulate the growth of the economy, whereas these two objectives had been seen in the past as contradictory. I have to say that over the past year or two, those shifts in IMF's position have not been confirmed, and it is still not clear to me whether the IMF has fully espoused the idea that social protection is to be part and parcel of all macroeconomic stimulus packages that countries should adopt, in particular in order to recover from the crisis. In fact, what we heard from Amira Miller is that countries still are under pressure from international financial institutions, including in particular the IMF, to manage their public finances in a way that is quote unquote sustainable, which in the language of the IMF, most often means that social protection should not be at the expense of fiscal discipline. And I fear that, unfortunately, that remains the dominant approach. In discussions we have with the ILO, with the IMF, with the World Bank, with others, the IMF has generally adopted the more cautious approach, advocating, of course, for cash transfers that protect people from extreme destitution, advocating for targeted support to the poorest amongst the poor, but not advocating for robust rights-based social protection schemes covering large groups of the population. And so I think we still are not in a position of saying that despite the social spending strategy announced in 2019, the IMF has joined the chorus behind a human rights-based approach to social protection.
Thank you very much, Olivier. I have a question.
Just saying, I saw Yi-hen also wanted to reply to this one.
I'm sorry about that.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted also to jump in on the question. To complete with what Olivier said, the IMF recently published a note on how the IMF country team should act in relation to social spendings in the recovery phase, in the different phase, including recovery phase. And it is clear that while we have some interesting points that were highlighted in the IMF strategy published in 2019, where they were advocating for more progressive taxation to increase fiscal space for social spendings, we can notice that in this recent note that has been published in October 2020 or November, very recently, that while we have some interesting declaration or statement from IMF, we can see when we scrutinize the document that we are afraid that clearly the IMF didn't change this position, and that they will the IMF country teams in the different countries will probably use the concept of fiscal sustainability, fiscal consolidation, and debt sustainability, or efficient spending to go back to austerity plan. And they clearly note in this note that the fiscal sustainability may become more binding as debt sustainability needs to be tackled. So the priority in recovery phase should be to pay back the debt and to have fiscal consolidation, which means austerity, to be able to repay back service debt to creditors. So the priority is not at all social spendings and social protection. And also, what is also I mean, that we can highlight as an entry point that human rights communities and also OHCHR or the UN agency can use, is that in the IMF report, this one, it's clear that they are asking the country team to clearly define what is the minimum spending or the new normal spending that authorities should spend on health and social spending, on social protection, etc. So I think here we have an entry point in which we can clearly say that the new normal spending is at least the minimum core obligation, and trying to define, to work together, engage with the IMF at the country level to try to at least maintain spendings for the minimum core obligation. And we should also try, I mean, we have an opportunity also to invest and engage discussion to define what is the debt sustainability, because the debt sustainability and fiscal sustainability principle will be used to shrinking fiscal space and go back to austerity measures. So we should define it integrating human rights and put human rights at the center and prioritize these spendings, social spendings, instead of paying back debt. And I think it is really here where we can influence and try to define clearly this human rights-based approach to macroeconomic policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you also, audience, for contributing with your interesting questions. There is a question for you, Yi-hen Shandul. Also, in your opinion, what legal frameworks may be used to effectively involve private actors in rebuilding post-pandemic economy better? So how can we involve private actors more effectively through legal frameworks?
I think we should clearly engage them and making them engage them in going beyond human rights principle and having binding text, integrating human rights in their way of engaging in countries. When we talk about big companies, but also I think we should use also the global fora that we have, like G20 and other global fora that discussed, for example, taxation issues, and are gathering all the key stakeholders, including private sector, to try to engage discussion on how we should also change the international order, international trade, but also international agreements like investment treaties, etc. They have taxation, for example, provisions that impact policy space for countries and cannot develop a progressive taxation scheme, for example. So we have clearly to discuss all these treaties and all these binding treaties, but also discussing them, integrating a human rights-based approach also to investment. For example, investment treaty agreement do not really take into account human rights. So I think we should take opportunities and discuss in this global fora and the different human rights principles and guide that we have to try to also have binding text. And it's clear that there is not a clear volunteer here right now to integrate private sector, but I think we should continue through these channels. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just to add on this, that I think also we should be more proactive in defining also, for example, what is an investment treaty with integrating human rights, and try to develop specific models. I think we are also lacking some proactive acts to really define with a human rights-based approach this type of treaties, for example, integrating human rights. And when we see, for example, in the negotiation of bilateral trade agreement or investment treaties, it's always the developed country who propose to the developing country the model. And they are either discussing minor change or adding or refusing in block the treaty. So why should we also try to develop these models, specific models, treaties and approaches more specifically, or principles? Why don't we have a debt sustainability principle defined with a human rights-based approach to try to discuss it with the IMF? I think we should also invest this space to advance the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have to a little bit short answers now, because we have still a number of questions. I see Marta.
Yeah, let me just jump in to add another component of in answer to the question, which is I think there's a lot that can be done at the local level too. We've got local governments that have said that they're ascribing to the SDGs. Those are contracting with corporations. There are ways that they can focus their contracts and also put requirements on the contracts about how benefits are allocated. So I think we should not only look on the macro level, but also think about what we can do locally.
Thanks for that, Martha, and a number of questions actually targeting the local as well. I mean, what can be done more? What sort of accountability mechanisms? Maybe you can just shortly reply on that as well, Martha. The accountability mechanisms at the local level on in particular economic social rights.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question, and of course it's challenging. There are, as I mentioned, there are ways to do it fiscally with contracts and budgeting mechanisms that build in a human rights component. I was very moved to see the the photo from Malawi of the judges, being and the lawyer myself, and thinking about the importance of the rule of law. And I do think that there are supports locally, around those rule of law accountability mechanisms that could be built in more structurally to local governance. Pittsburgh, I mentioned, just came out with their SDG report. And one of the things that they're doing is not just reporting on how they are doing on, achieving SDG goals, but they're going to adopt the SDG goals as part of their city governance. And so I think there are ways to really integrate those kinds of things into local government that mean that it's ongoing, that there's a reporting mechanism locally that allows much more access for participation, much more access for community pressure, and so on. So those are the kinds of things that I think are can be fruitful locally.
Thanks. I think we have here the panel for the next webinar on the accountability at the local level. I have one question, and I guess it's maybe to you, Olivier. The Global South is the ultimate victim of COVID-19. During the coming year, with the vaccine, we can expect recovery on the North, but not in the South. How long time will it take to get back to 2019? It's sort of looking a little bit quite a bit in the crystal ball.
Well, thank you, Martin.
And do you share the assessment that it will be sort of the North recovering first?
Well, of course, the paradox is that the contraction of the economy, the recession, is worse in rich countries, OECD countries, than in developing countries in the Global South, if you look just at that figure. But what is very clear is that developing countries are worst hit because their ability to react is much smaller. First, it costs these countries much more to borrow money in order to speed up the economic recovery. So they are not at all in a position to finance large economic recovery plans as we are in rich countries. Secondly, the debt of these countries has risen significantly because of capital flight that makes their local currency lose value in comparison to the currency in which their debt is labeled. Thirdly, these countries export raw materials, and the price of these raw materials has gone down on global markets as a result of the recession. And finally, some of these countries depend very heavily on remittances from migrant workers, particularly active in the catering and food industry, so that these remittances that are very important source of income for some of these developing countries have significantly reduced despite them playing an important role for some countries. So I think, yes, the shock is extremely hard on those countries in which, typically 70–80% of the working population is in the informal sector, with no or almost no access to whatever social protection there exists in the country. So the impacts on the country's finances, the impacts on the population will be extremely significant. So what I think is that this crisis is also an opportunity to send a very strong message about the duty of rich countries to support low-income countries' ability to establish standing, rights-based social protection floors. And with others, we made a proposal for a new international financial facility to that effect that we call the Global Fund for Social Protection. France has very strongly supported this in the context of the G7 and the G20. And the ILO is very much in support also of this idea. Just like we have a global fund on AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, just like we have a green fund, right, to support climate adaptation and mitigation projects, we need a fund to support the establishment of social protection floors. It is quite affordable. The ILO has calculated that for low-income countries to establish social protection floors for their population, the financing gap is only $78 billion. Now, that sounds a lot, but it's actually about half total official development assistance of the year 2019, and it's about 0.15% of the gross domestic product of rich countries. In other terms, if we were to make this a priority, we could really kickstart the effort of building rights-based social protection floors in developing countries to protect the population from future shocks. And I think that should now become a priority to help these countries not just overcome the immediate impacts of this crisis, but become much more resilient, because more crises are bound to come in the future.
Thank you very much, Olivier. And you started out, and I think you will also be the last voice from the panel. At least I may occupy the very last sound bite from here. But I really want to thank warmly our panel for extremely rich contributions from the Global South, Global North, and the general from the Special Rapporteur. And I must say, I think we have a very long agenda ahead of us, and from the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, I can commit ourselves to follow up on this. As I said earlier, and as you may have seen, we will come out with a book very soon on human rights and poverty, as well as another book on COVID-19 crisis and human rights, which are also addressing a number of these issues. So we really hope, and I think a number of issues have been addressed: the social unrest, corruption, the gap that are growing both in the north and the south, and definitely a lot of I think good ideas and our inspiration for where is it that human rights can feed into into bridging the gaps, as well as addressing the poverty. So thanks a lot, and thanks for all of you who came and joined in the discussion and came up with a number of good questions. We will share the questions with the speakers, and they may come back to you. So have a nice remaining part of the day, and hope to see you again in the future to follow up on this very complicated discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, everyone, audience as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, panel. It's really very